I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I will move quickly through the first section of my presentation because it's just some stage setting for information I think we are all familiar with. I run a lab at the University of Central Florida. They founded in 2016 when I first arrived at the university through an early careers researchers grant called Sound, Silence, and Environments. It's a philosophy of soundscape ecology lab. So we do the science, we do the big data analysis of soundscapes, but we also examine the methodological and conceptual and ethical issues that arise in the work of soundscape ecology. I came to this work through a fellowship I did several years back now with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. So Leopold's sort of ringing in my ears, if you will, as I'm thinking about sound and soundscapes. What I want to do in this presentation is think with you about tensions between species level work in soundscape ecology and individual level work. I'm doing that through Leopold's famous thinking like a mountain metaphor, and I'm going to circle back around to that in a few minutes. When I think about what soundscapes are, I think about their trajectory, their history. We've moved from thinking about sort of urban soundscape analysis in the 60s and 70s through Michael Southworth's work, through the sort of conceptual taxonomy of R. Murray Schafer, thinking about keynote sounds and signals and sound marks, again, thinking about the impacts of sound for human listeners, for human communities. We move then from acoustic ecology, which is a lot of the work that we've all been doing, into soundscape ecology, which moves from thinking, putting human listeners in a place of privilege to thinking about the way that non-human listeners engage in their sonic communities. Bernie Krause, who visited here, I think, just a couple of years back, and whom we're all familiar with. Bernie Krause's work, The Great Animal Orchestra, thinks about the way that sonic communities, ecological sonic communities, are networks, are orchestras or orchestrated through their listening and sonic and sounding communities. These sort of lexicons have developed through soundscape ecology as well. I sort of grew up in this community thinking about soundscape ecologies divided up into buckets, including biophony, anthrophony, and geophony, with some conversations about where techophony fits in there. But the shifting, the work of soundscape ecology generally is big data analysis longitudinal. We're interested in change for communities over time, ecological change over time. But as I started to work in my own lab and with my students and my researchers, started thinking about what we could do for individual listeners. So I partnered with the Central Florida Zoo here in this region, down in Sanford, for a long study, a 5-month study in which we recorded sound using the Wildlife Acoustic SM4 equipment that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. We recorded for a total of 950 hours or so of data, trying to think about what my initial interest was, how that site changes over time. We had 3 different sites at the zoo, focusing here on the giraffe location. You can tell from my video, I tried to give you a graphic representation. We tried to listen as giraffes in this case. So we put our equipment as high up as we could at sort of giraffe listening level. And we thought about strategic placement. So in this placement, the giraffe enclosure is sort of behind in the slide. Behind to the left off screen, if you will, is the train tracks. We have freight and passenger rail trains that go directly behind the giraffe enclosure. And in the foreground off camera here is the public walkway. So there's a lot of sonic space around the giraffes, and trying to think about the implications for noise on giraffe welfare was an interesting question for us. But we did this through soundscape ecology, and so we ended up with lots of big data to deal with. For the past several years, I've been working with teams, iterative teams of computer science students and faculty at my institution to develop Mangrove, which is a soundscape ecology data analysis package, a graphic user interface that builds on the sound ecology package in R, available through, both of these resources are available through GitHub if you're interested. They apply 4 algorithms designed and developed by Brian Pijanowski's team at Purdue University to analyze soundscape over time. There's really interesting tensions. I get into this space because these algorithms came to be so that you can run in a few minutes what would take 950 hours to record. So the idea of sitting and listening, the idea that I think Bernie Krause is indebted to as a musician and an ecologist, thinking about sitting and listening and engaging with place and space and species is something that we don't do when it comes to big data analysis. So there's some really interesting questions there, and we're continue to work on sound analysis. We did a report for the zoo. We worked with the zoo staff and the behaviorists and did some really interesting analyses about the soundscape, but that's not really what I came here to talk to you about. Although I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. What I really want to talk with you about is, again, this tension. The majority of studies like ours have focused on species level or environmental phenomena. There's a study that I really liked by Wiseman and Wilson back in 2016, looked at white rhinos in a zoo enclosure, and they did this incredibly detailed analysis of all the various sonic spaces around the giraffe, around the rhino rather, thinking about species level, species typical sonic experiences, and then broadening those out. Other researchers, including von Muggenthaler, Muggenthaler have worked on giraffes specifically, even more specifically on giraffe Helmholtz resonances. Helmholtz resonances are it's what happens when you blow sound over the mouth of a bottle. You get that low frequency sound. This is what giraffes are, how giraffes hum. I'm sure you've heard this idea that giraffes hum. So again, these are species level concerns. And I think that's where soundscape ecology has lived. It does live, especially through big data analysis, longitudinal species level concerns. And I think too, that's where acoustic ecology has grown up and developed since the 1960s and 70s, thinking about how human listeners experience place generally, right? Noise profiles, that's what's come around into noise studies, sound studies. This is sort of sound and health concerns. But I want to push more towards the individual. So I ran through a lot of slides very quickly, and now I can't move away from the microphones. Shoot. So I want to focus for a minute on this idea of the individual experience. The title of my talk involves the concept of biosemiotics. I've done a lot of work in this space. Biosemiotics, just as a brief history, comes out of the schools of semiotics, thinking about the ways that non-human listeners experience, non-human signifiers experience their worlds. Biosemiotics is the intersection of semiotic theory from Charles Sanders Peirce, the American semiotician, weirdly enough, and Jakob von Uexküll, the German biologist, Baltic German biologist. Uexküll's contribution to biology was Umwelt theory, and Umwelten are individual worlds of experience. I'm moving faster than I wanted to, so I'll give you an example here. If you're not familiar with Uexküll, in one of the examples he offers is of the tick, so the little insect. The tick, he says, has a very particular Umwelt. Its entire world of experience consists of only three signs: heat, butyrol, the pheromone given off by mammals, and light. Nothing else constitutes its world of experience. This is a really powerful example for biology and for Umwelt and for me too, because it suggests that each of us, you and me and the tick and the giraffe, all have very unique worlds of experience. And there's been a push in biology and in animal studies, and I think in soundscape ecology too, to think not about the experience of giraffes, like biologically, what can they hear, what range do they signal in, and all of these things, but instead, what is the experience of that giraffe? And this is the experience of Umwelt theory. The three giraffes I was working with at the Central Florida Zoo, one of whom passed away just shortly after our study, all have different life stories, right? They all hear differently, just like you and I all hear differently, and they all carry concepts of noise and sound differently. The younger giraffes, when they first come to the zoo, are more wary about human noise events at the zoo, the train. But interestingly, even though our big data analysis shows, and I wish I could have you listen to this, I'm not confident I can, but a lot of the recordings are that low thrum of a sitting freight train behind the giraffe enclosure, or the bell of a passing train, or the whistle of a train moving at high speed, a passenger train. When young giraffes come to the zoo, they notice this sound, right? But just like for you and I, if we live near train tracks, or if we're outside today and we hear planes flying over, it takes us to turn our attention towards that sound. We've been accustomed to it. And this is the case for these giraffes at the zoo too. They very quickly become accustomed to the train. So even though it shows up in my data as a huge anthrophonic noise signal. To the giraffes, it's just background noise. And so thinking about the particularities of the case is really the work of biosemiotics. It's the way that, and again, the work I'm doing in Soundscape Ecology is just one instance of biosemiotics, thinking about one type of signification, sonic signification. This is really important work to me. My lab developed out of this idea that has sort of been mulling in my mind of liminal spaces. The idea that you and I and most of the species around us now live at these tight intersections between natural spaces and human spaces, or wild spaces and developed spaces. We can dichotomize all we want, but we live in a world where human pressures now push against non-human animals in these really radical ways. And so every single experience is particular and unique and liminal. So this focus on liminal experience to me is really important. So what I want to conclude with is a sort of analogy. If any of you remember the old SATs, the American Standardized Test, these have gone away now, but I remember these analogies. The way to read this is soundscape ecology is to individual experience, just like a mountain is to green fire. Now, if you're Leopold fans or scholars, then you'll know this experience of the green fire, but I'll walk you through this. Again, if soundscape ecology is species level, ecological, just like thinking like a mountain is, then focusing on individual experience when we're doing acoustic ecology and soundscape ecology is the equivalent to the green fire moment. Leopold's very famous for being nicknamed the grandfather of ecology, thinking about the way that thinking like a mountain gives us this higher level longitudinal perspective on what it is to be ecologists. But he had in the same essay what's become known as the green fire moment. This, if you remember the story from Leopold, this is the case where back in the 40s, as a young man, he's hunting, and he and his hunting buddies see a pack of wolves down at the bottom of a ravine and open fire. And they kill lots of wolves, and they come down to the bottom of the ravine and they find one of the female wolves dying on the ground. And Leopold writes, has this moment where he says, I saw the green fire die from her eyes, right? So that he sees this wolf pass away. And it's a big moment for Leopold because it's, in my view, a shift in his thinking from ecology in these big systemic longitudinal ways, like change over time out of the Dust Bowl era, all of that business, to what's the point of the particular animal in a particular ecosystem. The wolf in the West became a paradigmatic example for Leopold. Through the conference, I was really excited to see the program because through the conference, even today, you're going to see a lot of examples of just this sort of dichotomy. A lot of us are talking about species level or ecological considerations around acoustic ecology, but there are these more particular moments too. And I think this tension between the individual and collective is a really important move for acoustic ecology and soundscape ecology. Thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to take a few questions. I think we've got a couple of minutes. And otherwise, I might donate the rest of my time to figuring out the sound problems before my colleague presents. Yeah.
And then you can repeat the question so that people are here.
Yes.
One question, very short. You play.
I'm gonna come back, Jeff.
Okay, hi. When you were analyzing the data from the Giraffe recordings, was there any data about, you mentioned giraffes can adjust to the sound, so you clearly observed it, but was there any kind of other biological markers or any other kind of data about giraffe reaction in a synchronous way with the sound map?
Yes. So actually the veterinarian at the zoo and I had long discussions about this. So what we did, the data was qualitative. We just got reports from the behaviors, the handlers of the giraffes. But the veterinarian and I did talk about if this analysis shows interesting moments of, disruptive noise profiles or something across particular areas, and we can find periodicity to those. Then he was interested in doing a cortisol study. So we can either track cortisol responses in fecal samples. The giraffes are handleable enough to even get salival samples. So tracking cortisol might be an interesting response, but there's a time delay between a stress response in a mammal and then cortisol response. So we'd have to track the periodicity of a noise event and say every Wednesday at 4 o'clock, a child screams or something, right? There'd have to be some sort of moment to track. Otherwise, it would be really hard to plan for a collection. And this is a problem, I think, for Umwelt studies and for biosemiotics. Like, how do you get to the experience of the individual organism? For me, it's a fascinating problem. As a philosopher, this is the problem of other minds. Like, how do I know what your experience is like when all I've got is my perspective? And we've done a good job in human science of sort of telling stories and building tools and strategies and theories to deal with that. And I think we're still working on that in the animal studies side. But it's, from my perspective, a pretty big turn in animal studies.